Hey, what's up guys? This is Clint Losh, and in today's video what I'm going to talk about are some rules of thumb. In my Skype group and when I'm doing coaching, I'm often posed with some very common questions, like when it comes to calling raises, calling all-ins, when you should shove all in, and also when studying your own game, how to apply the edge in sit and go wizard, or adjusting ranges appropriately. Well, because I've been posed these questions so many times, I felt that there were some rule of thumb calculations and considerations that you can apply very quickly and easily so that you're making the proper play, especially at the tables. If you're multi-tabling, for example, you need to make a quick decision. You need to know that you're making the proper plus EV long-term decision, especially when it comes to like I said, calling withdrawals, calling all-ins, situations that come up very often, and situations that, because they come up very often, you want to make sure you're doing them correctly, because that's what really determines your profitability in sit and goes. We always like to talk about hands that are really tough. Should you have bluffed the river? Should you have called that three-way all-in with ace-king? Those hands are very fun to talk about. They spark a lot of discussion, especially in the forums, in your Skype groups. But when it comes to really profiting at the tables and determining if you're a long-term winning player, it's really the basic decisions that determine whether you are a winning player. Because those decisions, while basic, or might seem basic, it's those that come up frequently. So you want to make sure that you get those frequent decisions correct more often than not. Maybe you made a wrong decision that knocked you out of game when calling that three-way all-in with ace-king, and maybe we decided, if I'm talking to a student, maybe we decided that, hey, you probably should have folded there. That situation is not going to come up a lot, so while it seemed like that decision there to call it with that ace-king knocked you out of that game, that type of play probably really won't determine whether you're a winning or losing player. It certainly sucked at the time, but the situations that are come up in this video, for example, are things that that will help determine if you're playing correctly or not. And also, not necessarily when just playing, but also reviewing your game. Sit and go wizard is a very common tool used used by most players, most sit and go players today, to determine correct ICM plays or even chip EV plays. However, I also believe that sit and go wizard probably costs more people money than it makes them. And the reason is, you can't just rely on the default settings that sit and go wizard provides. Because if you do, you're often going to have incorrect ranges, which are going to produce incorrect calculations in terms of a plus or negative EV play. So it's very important to know how to adjust the settings, adjust the ranges, adjust the edge. The edge is a very common topic that seems like a lot of people still aren't very comfortable with adjusting, to determine when you should, when you should make certain adjustments and when you shouldn't, and how much you should adjust. So that's what we're going to get into. Let's just jump right into it. So first thing, some of you may have heard this. It's called the 5-10 rule. Again, I'm going to be using some. You'll see the 5-10 rule, the 4-2 rule. These are some basic rules that can be used at the tables pretty easily, pretty effectively. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. These aren't absolute rules. There are considerations to help put you in the right situation more often than not. So essentially, the 5-10 rule is typically used when you're deciding whether to call a raise with a pocket pair. There's a lot of considerations, a lot of different calculations about, when you should be calling pocket pairs. We've all heard them. One in every 8 flops, you're going to hit your set. You should only call with 10-to-1 pot odds, 20-to-1 implied, 10-to-1 implied odds, 20-to-1 implied odds. Implied odds is very subjective, essentially meaning how much you could potentially win off your opponent. So if it's the first hand of a game, opponent raises to 90, you have to decide whether to call 90 or not with pocket fours, let's say. Well, your implied odds say you could potentially win an entire stack 1,500 off of that player. So typically there's a good risk-reward ratio of calling 90 to win 1,500. Well, sometimes it's not always that easy. I think most of us know that it's pretty easy to set mine in the early stages of a sit and go, at the 10-20 stage, 15-30 stage. If you're presented with just calling one raise to potentially win 1,500, you're usually in a good risk-reward scenario to call a small amount to potentially win a big amount. But what happens when you get to the 25-50 stage and you have a 1,500 stack and somebody raises to 150? Should you call with those pocket fours to try to hit your set? Or when you start getting, the blinds start getting bigger, and maybe you're a little bit deeper and you're still deciding whether to try to set mine. Well, the 5-10 rule can really make that decision process a little bit quicker, a little bit easier for you. Essentially, if it costs you 5% of your stack or less, make the call. It's cheap enough, and essentially 5% effective stack. If you have a 1,500 stack and somebody has a 400 stack, you're playing effective stacks there. If calling costs you 10% or more of your stack, you should fold. So going back to the example I brought up before, let's say you have a 1,500 stack and somebody raises to 150 at big blind 50. You would probably consider just folding there because 150 is 10% of your 1,500 stack. Now the question becomes, what happens if it's in between? In between 5 and 10, it's 7 or 8% of your stack to call. Well, that's when it becomes a judgment call. And that judgment call can be based upon several different variables. One, what player are you up against, and what's your position? Those are probably the two main considerations there. So for example, you'll see here, let's say you're on the button and a fishy player opens up and it costs me 8% of my stack to call. I would potentially look to call there more often. Why would I call there? Two main reasons. One, you're in position. You're in position, you have a little bit more pot control, maybe you have a chance to take, you don't always have to hit your set to win. You could potentially take it away on the flop if your opponent checks, or the turn. So you obviously, playing in position is better than playing out of position. I think we all know that. So there's a natural advantage to playing on the button, not just hit your set, but potentially take it away on the flop or future streets. But also, always have in the back of your mind, when you're playing against a fishy, random player, just a losing player in general, quite simply, when you hit your hand, especially if you hit a set, it's much easier to get your opponent's entire stack than, say, playing against a reg or somebody who understands the game and is probably not going to put their entire stack at risk without a pretty decent hand. So it's quite simply just easier to get their entire stack. So if I'm in between that 5 and 10% area, I would look at those situations. Am I in position? Am I playing against a guy I can get his entire stack? Then I would probably make that more marginal call because there's a higher likelihood of getting paid off if I do hit my hand. On the flip side, let's say you're out of position and you get a reg who raises from middle position and you have pocket fours there and it costs you 8-9% of your stack. I'm probably not going to call there. Even if you hit your hand, you may not be. You can't really say my implied odds are I get his entire stack. It's not always that easy. So you're less likely to get their entire stack. You're most likely going to be check folding. Since you're out of position, if you don't hit your set, it's going to be tougher to play on future streets, especially with smaller pocket pairs and you have overcards on the board. You're not looking to make too many check raise bluffs or do reverse floats. So playing out of position in general is just going to have a negative EV. It's going to be a negative EV situation that you put yourself in, especially versus a reg. So that's the 5-10 rule. Maybe you know it. Maybe you've heard a variation of it. It's a quick and easy one to do right at the table. If you have tables flying up and you're trying to make a decision on whether to to call that raise with that pocket pair, this is a quick rule that you can use to justify calling or folding. The next one, the 4-2 rule, the 2-4 rule, it's however you want to say it. Essentially what this is finding your percentage odds of hitting your hand. And here's what it says. So essentially, let's say you're on the flop and you want to figure out the odds of, what are my odds of hitting my flush? I have 2 hearts in my hand, I got 2 hearts on the board, you have that flush draw. What are the odds of hitting your one of your outs on the turn. So you have one card to come. You're going to multiply your outs. So let's say you have two hearts on the board. You have a flush, standard flush draw. You have 9 outs. You want to figure out what are their percentage chances of hitting your hand on the turn. You take 9 times it by 2. There's an 18% chance that you're going to hit your flush on the turn. Same thing goes, let's say you're on the turn and the river still needs to be dealt. Essentially you have one more card to come. Then you multiply by 2 again and you say, oh, I have an 18% chance of hitting my hand on the river. So that's taking the 2%. When you have one card to come, you multiply your outs by 2, you get your percent chance of hitting your hand. If you're on the flop, and let's say you're waiting for the river, meaning let's say somebody shoved it all in, and if you're going to call, you're going to see the turn and the river, you multiply your outs by 4 to get your odds. So if you have the flush draw, somebody's all in, you need to figure out your percent chance of hitting your hand by the river. You take your 9 outs, you times it by 4, you have a 36% chance of hitting your hands. Now the way this comes into effect and how to use it appropriately is you essentially compare your pot odds to determine whether to call or not. And to get your percent of the pot odds, you do the cost to call divided by the cost to call plus the pot. It's a quick calculation to do and you essentially compare that. You see what the pot odds are and the percent chance of hitting, and determine whether you have the appropriate odds to justify a call. Now, one thing to really keep in mind when using the 4-2 rule, 2-4 rule, whatever you want to call it, the only time you should really use the rule of 4 and multiply your outs by 4 is if your opponent's all in. You don't want to get to the flop, have a flush draw, straight draw, whatever, and somebody makes a bet. And then you have to determine, you're going to say, oh, well, the pot's this size, I have 9 outs, I'm going to multiply it by 4, I have a 36% chance of hitting my flush. Yeah, you have a 36% chance of hitting your flush by the river, not by the turn, because there's probably going to be another bet on the turn. So you can't justify a call on the flop and using the rule of 4, because again, there's going to be some more action on the turn as well that we need to take into consideration. So really the only time, and this is probably the biggest mistake people do, I mean, this is a pretty common rule. It's been talked a lot about in forums and different strategy sites, so it's not something brand new by any means, and this is not my rule. I actually think it was brought up by Phil Gordon in one of his poker books. He was the one that introduced this rule. And again, the biggest mistake is that people use the rule 4 on the flop thinking that they're just going to see the river. It's only if somebody's all in. So let's get into some quick examples. So here's some common examples and essentially the accuracy of this rule and maybe some modifications we can make to it to get it even more accurate. So here are some common outs that, or common hands that we could have in the outs associated. If you have a gut shot, you have 4 outs straight, 8 outs, 9 outs for a flush, and a big draw like a straight and a flush draw where you got 15 outs. So if we take the gut shot where you have 4 outs, the actual chance of hitting your hand there is 8.7%, one card to come. If you use the rule of 2 where you multiply 4 times 2, it's 8%. So of course it's a little bit off. We're dealing in tenths of a percent here. That's okay. Being off by a couple tenths of a percent or even 1%, it's not going to affect it that much. Again, what we're going for here is quick calculations to put you or to give you a good idea of what play you should make and in what kind of situation you're in. So if you're trying to do difficult calculations at the table, getting specific outs and or percentages, the 4-2 rule can be a nice one to add in if you aren't doing it already. And again, let's say you have a gut shot, somebody's all in, you want to say, oh, what are my chances of hitting a gut shot by the river? Your actual chances are 16.5%, and if you just use the rule of 4, multiply it by 4, you get 16%. And I'm not going to go through every single one here. You guys can pause the video, read through this. What I will say is some modifications can be made to get more accurate. Typically where these percentages or this rule of 4 or 2 gets a little bit out of whack is when you have a lot of outs. So let's take for example the the straight and the flush draw where you have 15 outs. You could see here that, let's say somebody's all in and you're contemplating this big all in, seeing what your odds are, or your percent chance of hitting by the river. Your actual chance of hitting by the river is 54.1%. But the rule of 4 says, if you just multiply 15 by 4, it's 60%. Well, that's a little ways off. That's a whole 6% off. Typically, and you'll see the modification down here, one of these modifications that I actually read about is that when you have greater than 8 outs, so 9 outs, 10 outs plus, for more accuracy, what you want to do is take your outs, like we normally do, multiply it by 4, then subtract that percentage, or you want to take the difference of your outs from 8. So let's do a quick example. You have 15 outs. The difference between 15 and 8 is 7. So what we do is we multiply our outs by 4, we get 60, and we're going to subtract 7, which is the difference of the outs and 8. So we said 15 minus 8 is 7, 60 minus 7 is 53. It gets us much closer. And you can see how that works pretty well for the flush draw. You have 9 outs. 9 times 4 is 36%. To get your true, to get close to this true percentage, 9 minus 8 is 1. So just subtract 1 from the percentage. You don't need to get too hung up there on one percentage point. Obviously, the more outs you have, you want to get a little bit more accurate. But to be honest, if you have greater than 50% equity anyway, then typically, no matter what the person bets, you're going to be you're obviously in a very plus EV scenario there anyway. So whether you have 54 or 60%, you're pretty good. You're going to be a pretty good scenario. But those are some modifications, and modifications to the rule of 2. You take the rule of 2 and just add 1 to get a little bit more accurate as well. So if you look at these, the rule of 2, if you have a straight draw, 16, so about a percentage off from 17.4, so you just add 1. You add 1 to the flush draw, you get a little bit more accurate. But so you can keep those modifications to the back of your head, but the most important thing is that you know how to apply these rules. If you didn't already know how to use them, hopefully now you know that when you're calculating those odds, you compare it to your pot odds and see if you have the appropriate percentage to justify a call. All right, here's an interesting one, the 20% rule. This type of situation usually happens when you're in a limped pot, there's some antes, and it's typically there to show you whether you should shove all in or not. Like, for example, let's say you have 14 big blinds or 13 big blinds. That type of stack, you're typically not just going to open shove in a sit and go. But what happens if there's one limper, two limpers, or maybe there's antes involved at a full table? Well, you can't necessarily just say, well, I'm not going to shove a 14 big blind stack. You have to look at your stack overall compared to the pot and determine that risk-reward ratio. Well, if you look at the pot and it's 20% of your stack or more, you typically will have the proper risk-reward ratio to justify a shove. So and again, maybe in a 3-bet pot as well, or you're contemplating a 3-bet. Maybe there's antes, or maybe somebody just raises, and you look at their raise. You look at the pot, you see how big that pot is compared to your stack. Sometimes I see, well, I don't want to shove this big, but in reality, if you look at the pot and it's 20% or more of your stack already, then shoving all in is perfectly fine. Doing anything less may not be optimal. Maybe 3-betting smaller. There's obviously different variables to whether you should 3-bet small or not. But especially if you're sitting with a hand like King Jack, King Queen, or 14 big blinds with limpers, just raising is probably not going to be great. You can justify shoving if that pot is 20% or more of your stack, or close. If it's 19%, 18%, you're in that area. And I'll just show you a quick example. And actually, I was going through some of my hands, and I couldn't find an exact example for the hands that I actually have on this computer of a spot where I had exactly 20% or more. But here's a situation, and not that this is a difficult scenario. But I just wanted to show you that you get a limper here on the button. Obviously, not the best player in the world is probably limping the button. But here we are, 14 big blinds total, but 13 and a half sitting behind after posting the antes. And what should you do? Sometimes I see people raise like 400 here, which I really don't like. You can get called. You're playing out of position. It can be a kind of a nasty spot. But the pot is 250. 20% of my stack would be 270 actually. So we're right there. We're right in that realm. It's not exact, but that's essentially what we're looking at. We're looking at the pot compared to your stack. If it's 20% or more of your stack, then you can justify a shove. And to do the quick, figuring out if you have what's 20% of your stack, maybe you don't know how to do the quick rule. Essentially, 10% you just move. Think about a decimal point after the 5 here of my 1365. 10% you just move it over. So 10% would be 136, and then multiply that by 2, and you get 270. So that's the quick way to find out if it's 20% or not, or what 20% of your stack would be. So that's the quick 20% rule. That's probably one that actually pops up a lot when I'm doing coaching sessions or even reviewing hands for guys in the Skype group that I'm in. I'll see raises in certain spots like this, or they don't want to shove hands like King Queen and maybe Ace 8, because they'll just look at it and say, well, I don't want to shove 14 big blinds. You can't look at it just as 14 big blinds. You got to compare the pot to your stack. So that's the key consideration there. All right. Again, another pretty basic, easy rule of thumb that if you weren't aware of it already, you can toss it into your game now. And it's these types of rules again will help with multi-tabling, playing more tables, justifying plus EV plays. So those are some of the basic ones of in-game. What I'm going to get to now is some rule of thumbs when using Sit and Go Wizard. Now, I wanted to talk about Sit and Go Wizard and some rule of thumbs there because, like I said, when I first started this video, I really do feel that Sit and Go Wizard costs more people money, costs people more money than it makes them. And the reason is because there are a lot of things to adjust in Sit and Go Wizard that aren't always adjusted. If you just stick your whole entire hand history into Sit and Go Wizard, it'll pop out all the hands, and it'll give you that green check mark, the red X, or the caution symbol, whether you made a good or bad shove. You don't want to just rely on that because what those decisions are based upon the edge, which needs to be adjusted, and it's based upon the ranges. So you need to be aware of how to adjust your opponent's ranges to understand whether you should shove all in, call, what's actually plus EV and what isn't. So this first one is something that I adjusted on my own. I'll be honest, I'm not sure if other people are doing this. I'm not sure exactly how accurate it is, but it makes sense to me, and I wanted to share it. And this is what I talk to a lot of people about when using Sit and Go Wizard. Let's say you're like in a high ICM spot, like you're on a bubble, and you're trying to justify, somebody shoves all in, and you need to make that tough call. And you use Sit and Go Wizard to see, hey, should you have called, should you have folded? One thing I find with Sit and Go Wizard that can be a little bit misleading is having different size stacks, but one stack is slightly bigger than the other stack. So what I call it is equalizing stacks. That to get a more accurate assessment of your range and the appropriate hands to, let's say, call and all in with, you should equalize the stacks to get a better idea. So let me give you an example here. So what I took a screenshot. Sorry, I didn't take a screenshot. I'll be pulling up Sit and Go Wizard here in a second. I went to an 18-man Sit and Go, and we're on the bubble. So 5 people left at big blind, 600 with ante 50. And everybody has around equal stacks, 5,000 to 6,000 chip stacks. So let me pull that up real quick. So here we go. So we are hero here in the big blind. We have ace queen suited. We have a 6,000 stack. So we have right at 10 big blinds. And then the cutoff, I have shoving here. And the cutoff has 5,000. So in this situation, we have the cutoff covered by 1,000 chips. Now, I'm not too concerned about what he's shoving with. I don't want to debate what he's shoving with because it really doesn't matter for the point of what I want to show you. He has a 5,000 stack and shoves it all in. We have ace queen suited. If he does this, it's saying we should call, according to Sit and Go Wizard, the difference is, 0.25, it's a 0.25% plus EV play, which is a pretty good edge, potentially. Again, there's some other variables to take into consideration, but, looking at this in a vacuum for a second, it's saying we should call with ace-queen suited, pocket nines plus, and ace-king. Okay, fine. What I'd like to do, like I said, is equalize stacks. Sorry, let me step back. The reason that this is a call here is because Sit and Go Wizard shows that we still have equity in this tournament if we lose. Meaning, if we lose here, we still have 1,000 chips. So, it's saying you're still alive, you still have equity, we can justify the call here. But in reality, at Big Blind 600, you have 1,000 chips with other 6,000, 5,000 chip stacks. You're not in a great scenario. You're most likely have to get very lucky now to not bubble this sit and go. So whenever you're in a situation like that, where maybe you have 500 chips left or 1,000 chips left, and you look at a Sit and Go Wizard, equalize the stacks to get a more accurate range. So what I want to show you here is, look at the difference if we go from having just 1,000 chips left, which means we're going to have to get ultra lucky to even do anything. Let's give the guy that shoves our exact stack, 6,000. Now you can see it becomes a massive fold. Negative 2.73% fold. That's massive, and saying jacks plus. So, actually, let's change this back to 17%. So, still didn't change it. I mean, 1%, but it still shows a negative EV play. That, I think, will get you more accurate ranges to make sure that you're not calling too lightly in situations where, yeah, you may be alive if you lose, but you're going to have a stack that is just completely depleted, and you're going to have to get lucky to progress any further. Now, there are, again, some other variables, like I said. How tough is this table? Do you want to take these marginal edges? At a tough table, yes, you will. At a fishy table, you probably don't want to take this play by any means. So, this is a consideration to make when looking at your own game in Sit and Go Wizard. See what the difference is. If you have 500 chips more than your opponent and he shoves, and it's giving you a specific range to call with, especially in a high ICM situation. That's typically where you'll see these big differences. And when like on the bubble, around the bubble, something like that. Think about equalizing the stacks to get a better range. And I found that that'll give you more accurate ranges, and hopefully increase your profitability overall. Alright. Another Sit and Go Wizard rule of thumb, or not necessarily rule of thumb, but more of a rule to kind of keep in the back of your mind. It's the edge adjustment. Now, let me pop this back up real quick. Sit and Go Wizard. You'll see this edge here. This edge is it's so often talked about, but there really isn't a lot of information on it. Like how should you adjust it? And it essentially gives you that that cushion, that ICM cushion to justify a call. What kind of edge do you want to take? What kind of plus long run plus EV percentage do you want to have in a situation? Like I said, like if you're against a really bad player or you're at a bad table, you typically you may not want to take those really thin edges, because you could potentially find really higher plus EV or bigger edge plays in other spots, and you don't want to put yourself at risk in a really thin spot that could hurt you for the rest of the game. But then on the flip side, you might want your edge to be, you don't mind taking a thinner edge, if you're at a really tough table. So let me go back to this real quick. So that's taking into consideration your opponents. But I find that the edge adjustment will help you get a better idea of how wide you should shove or how tight you should shove based upon your stack size. Typically, if you have greater than 10 big blinds and you're contemplating shoving, you want to give yourself a little bit bigger of an edge because you have a bigger stack. You have more to lose. Now, I've talked to different regs, other top players, and I've asked them, how do you adjust your edge? And I've certainly gotten a lot of different answers. And not that any of them are wrong, they're definitely more subjective. But the general rule is more than 10 big blinds, you will probably want to increase your edge. You want more of a cushion. If you're going to risk a 12 or 13 big blind stack, you want to make sure you're definitely making a very solid plus EV play. When you are less than 10 big blinds, 9, 8, 7 big blinds, you probably can't look to take many plus EV spots now because you're getting a little bit more desperate. You need to shove a little bit wider because the worst thing you could ever do in a sit and go is get blinded out. So as you approach that, that 5 big blind danger zone where you have to start shoving 82 cards, you may want to start looking to take some break even or slightly negative EV shoves so that you can help preserve your future equity. That'll give you an opportunity to make more plus EV plays in the future than you otherwise would have been able to with your current stack. So again, we want to adjust our edge down, but how far down? One of the regs and one of the guys who's in my Skype group, he's a guy that actually coached me. What he did was he dropped down. If you look at your, and I'll go back to Sit and Go Wizard for a second. If you look at this percentage EV number here, for every big blind below 10, he would start dropping his edge by 0.1. So at 9 big blinds, he'd be okay with taking a negative, he would drop it down by 0.2, taking a negative 0.2 edge. He would want it because he felt that when you were getting lower than 10 big blinds, you needed to get your stack above that 10 big blind mark so you could stay afloat, so you can make some more plus EV plays in the future. So for every big blind below 10, he would drop this edge by negative 0.2. And then, so at 9 big blinds, he would take a negative 0.2 edge. At 8 big blinds, he would take a negative 0.4 edge. All the way down to 5 big blinds, where you could take a whole negative 1% edge. And again, that's very subjective, and I don't always agree that you need, for every time, in every situation you have 9 big blinds, you take negative 0.2. Because there are times where you don't have to take that negative edge with that type of stack. It's still a very manageable stack, especially if like the rest of your table has 9 big blinds. You're not in desperation mode. You don't always have to drop down that negative edge. But with that being said, I think what that will do is kind of get in the back of your mind that when you're analyzing your game, or even when you're in-game and playing, and you're sitting on the button, maybe there's 5 players left, blinds are getting high, you have 9 big blinds, 8 big blinds, the blinds are coming around again, where, yeah, right now you have 9 or 8 big blinds, but if you get hit with the blinds again through another orbit, your stack is going to be really depleted, and now you're really in that desperation zone of having to shove potentially any 2 cards, and potentially either have some fold equity or get lucky and hope your cards hold up. So, like I said, the situation you never really want to be in is where you get into that desperation mode. So you want to do whatever you can to avoid getting there. So if that means taking a slightly negative EV edge or making a slightly negative EV play when you're getting below 10 big blinds and maybe you're in late position, shoving only through a couple players, that's a consideration you're going to have to take. And again, this is not a hard rule of thumb in terms of how much you would need to adjust that edge, but it's more a rule to kind of keep in the back of your mind of how you want to look at your game currently and in the future. And Sit and Go Wizard only looks at current plays. It doesn't consider, hey, are the blinds going to hit you the next hand? That's another reason to take a negative EV edge and drop your edge down. If you're going to get hit with the blinds the next hand, that 7 big blind stack is going to probably go down to 6 and 5 once it goes through the big blind and small big blind, or the small blind. Sorry. So that's a consideration you need to make. And on the flip side, for every big blind above 10, you should probably look to adjust your edge up to have that cushion to make sure you're not risking a bigger stack, a more manageable stack, on potentially a break-even play when you might not need to. Another consideration to take when when thinking about your edge adjustment is your position at the table. I'm going to be doing another video on just edges and situations, specific hand histories. What I wanted to do right now is give you some considerations to make. And one of them is, let's say you're in the small blind, and you have 10 big blinds versus your opponent who has 10 big blinds. Some might say you could shove any 2 cards there, depending on your opponent. What do you want to do when analyzing that situation in Sit and Go Wizard? What I like to do is adjust that edge up by, let's say you have 10 big blinds, by 0.1 or 0.2, at least 0.2, to guarantee that I'm probably making a very plus EV play. Because, for example, if you're shoving any 2 cards, and if it's a plus EV play according to Sit and Go Wizard, that might be based upon whatever range Sit and Go Wizard assigns. So if you have a very marginal plus EV play when you're shoving any 2 cards, that plus EV play can become very negative if your opponent's range is slightly off than what Sit and Go Wizard tells you. And that's the thing, guys. You very rarely are going to know what your opponent's calling range is 100%. So accordingly, you have to adjust, because if you're making a very thin play with shoving any 2 cards, you want to be pretty sure you're going to be making a plus EV play before you're shoving 7 deuce offsuit into the big blind. So what you want to do is probably adjust up your edge to 0.2 at least, to compensate for the potential fluctuations in your opponent's calling range than maybe what you estimate. So that way you get a more accurate assessment of what you should shove. And again, that's when in late position, when you're probably going to be shoving really, really wide, maybe any 2 cards, 90%, 80% from the small blind or from the button. So when you're making those wide shoves into other similar stacks that maybe you're at 11 big blinds, 10 big blinds, you should probably adjust your edge up a little bit. At least probably 0.1, 0.2, I've heard even others say 0.3, even higher, to make sure you're guaranteed you're making a plus EV play. But then, again, if you look at that edge adjustment from early position, let's say under the gun, and you have 10 big blinds, you don't need a big edge when shoving under the gun, because you're probably going to be shoving solid hands anyway. Ace King, Ace Queen, maybe Ace Jack, Pocket 8s, 9s. You're going to be shoving solid hands in that situation. So you don't necessarily need that 0.2 or 0.3 edge to justify a shove. You don't need to. Well, let's just say you don't need to adjust it up so high to justify it, because you're already shoving solid hands that you know are plus EV plays in the long run. So those are the main adjustments to Sit and Go Wizard that I think really hurt people when analyzing their game. Now, the other thing that really hurts as well, there's no real rule of thumb for it. It's just make sure you adjust your opponent's ranges. Don't always take what Sit and Go Wizard says as this is what your opponent's range is. You need to adjust it based on what you know about that opponent, the situation, the stack sizes, etc. So there's no rule of thumb for that, so it doesn't really fit into this video. But these are 2 specific things that I'm always mentioning to players that I'm coaching in terms of make sure you equalize your stacks if your opponent's stack is not much different from yours, to get an accurate assessment of maybe what your calling range should be, for example. And then with the edge adjustment, you're getting short stack. Don't always look to make a plus EV shove when you're short stack, because what can actually happen there is if you don't adjust your edge, if you're looking at Sit and Go Wizard and you're always looking for a plus EV shove and you're sitting there with 6 or 7 big blinds, you're probably going to be too tight, and what's going to happen is you're not going to put yourself in a position to pick up chips to help you for future spots. You're probably going to find yourself getting blinded down too much. So know how to adjust your edge. It's a little bit more subjective. I am going to do another video specifically on edge adjustment, because I think it is important, and I think it's important to see full hand histories, full hands, to see how ranges change in terms of the edge adjustment. So, but keep these considerations in mind. Later position, you have 10 big blinds or more, you want to adjust your edge up a little bit to compensate for shoving such a wide range. You want to make sure it's a plus EV play based upon a potential unknown calling range of your opponent. So the increase in the edge will help with that unknown aspect of the calling range. Likewise, if you are in early position, you don't need to necessarily adjust it up. Plus EV, break even or plus EV is going to be fine. And then again, less than 10 big blinds, you can start adjusting your edge down potentially. And greater than 10 big blinds, you might want to adjust it up because you have a bigger stack to lose. So I hope these rule of thumbs, this was a pretty quick video. Maybe this might be basic for some of you, but I think those rules can be very helpful. Maybe they're just reiterating what you already knew, but it can be nice to add into your game right away. The rule of 5-10 rule for calling with pocket pairs to set mine. The 4-2 rule of quickly calculating your percentage odds of hitting your hand, and the 20% rule. So look at the pot, see if it's 20% of your stack in a limp pot, or even if you're going to consider 3-betting. If it's 20% of your stack or more, go ahead and shove. It can be perfectly fine to do so in terms of risk versus reward. So hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to be doing another video on looking fully at edge adjustment, and I'll see you in the next video, guys.